This is Devlog, an office-themed roguelike that has changed a lot over the years, but the current state of the game might be the most boring one yet. Where previously there was always some kind of gameplay, now there's just a table. So today we're going to be fixing that by adding some office-themed enemies to the game. But actually, we won't, because these aren't the enemies we're making today, these are. And that may seem like a bit of a confusing choice. After all, why would making literal square enemies be better than making ones that actually look good and fit the office theme? Well, it's because it's not really about the squares, it's about what they represent. You see, every enemy idea for this game has always been something like this. It's a guy named Gregory, who is always on his phone, and his attack is throwing his phone at the player. And on the surface, this doesn't even really seem like a bad idea, until you realise it's the wrong way around. Instead of designing based on gameplay, it's designed based on a story, a character, visuals, which leads to a game that may look good, but feels horrible to play. And that's exactly what happened to my game over the past 2 years, and I think this might be the solution. So here's what I want to know. Does stripping an enemy of its visuals actually fix these problems? And does just focusing on the gameplay allow me to finally design good enemies? Or does it all just lead to bad enemies that happen to be square? In the end, there's only one way to find out. But before we can actually get to that, there's something else I need to fix first. You see, the old enemies had a problem, something that's been annoying me for the past 2 years, but I always thought was too hard to fix. What I'm talking about is their pathfinding, but that's a bit misleading, because they were always able to find their path perfectly. And even now, if you make an enemy in our current project and use the exact same pathfinding plugin, you can see that it's still able to easily find a path towards the player. The problem is how the enemy then follows that path, because instead of actually following it, the enemy just kind of slides in its general direction. You can see it very clearly in these old enemies. They're supposed to be running towards you, but it feels more like they're kind of sliding on ice. The reason for this is that both enemies are using the built-in movement script that comes with the plugin. And the way this script works is that it just keeps adding a force that moves the enemy in the right direction. But it never actually slows the enemy down, it just kind of keeps adding more and more force. So to make sure that it doesn't fly off, it uses Unity's linear drag system, which you can compare to air resistance slowing it down. And although it fixes the enemy just flying off, it also causes this imperfect movement. And sadly, because it's coded like this, the only way I can fix it is by writing my own movement script. Luckily, Brackeys has a tutorial on exactly how to do this, but the code he writes uses the exact same linear drag technique. As you can see, the bird in their video moves exactly the way we don't want our enemies to move. So I had to make some adjustments. Instead of adding a force, we're going to be setting the velocity of the enemy. And although it's a bit more inflexible, it does give us exact control over where the enemy goes. However, by making it more exact, we also made it more choppy, because whenever the path updates, the enemy immediately moves in that new direction, with no regard to where it was moving before, which also doesn't feel right. So to fix that, we need to smooth between the direction we are currently moving and the direction we're supposed to be moving. And this is fairly easy. We just check what our current direction is, what direction we're supposed to be moving in, and put them both in a lerp function. This means that every frame, the enemy moves a slight bit more in the right direction, until it eventually follows the path perfectly again. And if we make this amount it moves per frame high enough, it's barely even noticeable that the two are different. And surprisingly, this code actually worked first time, and I was so close to just moving on when this happened. And just in case you can't tell, that is us, the player, somehow being able to walk all the way around the table and start to chase the enemy instead. And what's happening here is such a weird bug, because the game knows there's a shorter path, and officially the enemy is following that path. In fact, that's the only thing it can do. The entire script is just go to path. Period. It's not go to path unless the player walks all the way around the table, then just keep following an old path that you don't know, is not saved anywhere, and doesn't exist anymore. And I know I'm joking about it now, but this was something that literally shouldn't have been possible, and yet somehow it still happened. Not just once either, like I was able to recreate this bug very consistently, which just made it even more confusing. However, after a lot of testing, I did figure out one thing. It was only happening if I was using the direction smoothing. If I turned it off, it would go back to normal. But because I really couldn't think of why that had anything to do with following an old path, I did something I've never done before. I used gizmos. Now, for those of you that don't know what gizmos are, they're these lines, colors, and shapes that are only visible in the editor, and they're mostly used for visualizing something that is happening in a script, and I thought this might help me identify what was going on. So I made two gizmos, one for the current direction in yellow, and one for the path direction in red, and this finally showed me what was happening. You see, every time the enemy had to turn around, the path direction would start pointing in the other way, and slightly downward. And because the script rotates the current direction around the shortest angle, it wants the enemy to first go down. But because there's an obstacle there that it's trying to move around, it instead bumps into that obstacle, which resets its vertical velocity, changing the current direction back to its original state. And bizarrely, this meant that basically by complete accident, it kept moving along the original path. And I gotta be honest, even though the bug makes sense to me now, it's still one of the weirdest things I've ever come across. But luckily it was very easy to fix. I just made the current direction independent of what direction we're actually moving in. The result is nearly identical, but at least now it's following a path that actually exists. Okay, I've been talking about pathfinding and weird bugs for long enough now. Let's actually use some of this stuff to make enemies, which means I have to come up with good enemy ideas, and that's something I really struggle with. So instead of coming up with full ideas, I wrote down a bunch of enemy actions, which are basically just anything an enemy can do, like walk towards the player, shoot a bullet, explode, you get the idea. Then when it was time to actually start working on an enemy, I just picked an action I thought would work. And in this case, that was the player dash. And with the action chosen, the rest of the enemy just kind of designed itself. The enemy would walk towards the player until they're within the dash range, and then after a short cooldown, they would dash towards the player, which is a simple but good enough idea. And within the hour, that's exactly what I had. But we aren't quite done yet, because currently it doesn't check if there's anything between the enemy and the player, causing it to just kind of slam into the table. So to fix this, I drew a line between the two, and if the line touches anything that the enemy can't dash through, it will delay the dash until there's nothing in the way. But this still causes a couple of issues. For example, the enemy would always dash the exact moment it was allowed to, causing it to still hit the table. So I had to make two changes. First, I changed the one line to 4 lines, all going from the edges of the enemy instead of the middle, so that even if one has a clear line of sight to the player, it doesn't dash until all 4 of them do. Secondly, I added a very small delay before the enemy is allowed to dash. This eliminates any close calls and just generally makes it feel a bit more natural. Okay, the dash enemy is actually pretty close to finished. I only really want to change how it stops dashing, because currently it just kind of abruptly stops and then instantly starts following the player again. So to make all of this a bit more fluent, I added some smoothing to both the end of the enemy dash and the start of the follow movement, which is a bit ironic because that's the entire thing I was trying to get rid of before. But the big difference now is that if it doesn't work for a certain enemy, or we just don't like it, we can just get rid of it by clicking a button. But with that, the enemy is actually pretty much done. However, before we move on, there is something else I want to change. Not something about the enemy, but about the environment. Because for some reason, YouTube really hates these lines, doesn't it? And you might have actually been wondering what's wrong with the footage, because it looks all blurry and weird. For the record, this is not what it looks like. On my screen, it actually looks really good, but for some reason, YouTube's compression just completely ruins it. So for your viewing pleasure, I'm going to temporarily turn it off. I think the background now looks extremely boring, but at least the quality of the video isn't suffering. Okay, remember when I said that we were done with the dash enemy? Turns out I was wrong, because I realized that it was still missing something crucial. Telegraphing. In case you don't know what that is, it's when the enemy announces its attack so that the player has time to react. But because these squares don't have animations or sound effects, we're going to have to keep it very, very simple by just changing the color. Whenever the enemy is about to attack, it now becomes a darker shade for about half a second. Seems like a bit of a small change, but things like that are actually very important. Another thing I also didn't realise that we still had to do was test multiple of these enemies at the same time. So I duplicated the enemy a couple times, changed their colour to purple because red was getting a bit generic, and hit play. And I immediately noticed they were doing something I didn't want them to. They kept dashing into each other, not only disrupting their own dash, but also pushing the other enemies. Luckily, this was a fairly easy fix. Just like with the table, I just made every enemy check whether there was an enemy between them and the player, and if there was, they couldn't dash. This basically fixes the entire issue, which means that the dash enemy is now officially finished. But before we get to making the next enemy, this video is actually sponsored by NordVPN. Okay, let's just be honest, you know what a VPN is, and if you don't, I'm very impressed you managed to avoid it for so long, unless you're a literal baby who discovered the internet today and decided to watch one of my videos, in which case, go to sleep? I don't know what babies do. Anyways, I could talk about the fact that a VPN allows you to change your location so that you can watch a show that isn't available in your country, but I would also probably be the millionth person to do so. So instead, I'm going to talk about ads. In an ad, like some kind of adception. But although adception sounds like a weird knockoff movie, what I'm talking about is actually kind of important, because we all know companies show us ads, like all the time, but how do they know that you specifically were in the market for a giant rubber duck to disrupt the local shipping industry? Well, it's because they track your online activity, literally keeping a log of everything you do online, which I personally find a terrifying thought, and that's where one of NordVPN's other functions comes into play, because besides allowing you to watch Netflix on vacation, they also just literally have a button to disable this kind of tracking. And as a little bonus, it also just straight up removes all of your ads, which is quite nice. So if you no longer want companies to know your secret rubber duck plans, or if you're just tired of ads, go to nordvpn.com/Deynum Studio to get more than 70% off a 2-year plan. That's nordvpn.com/Deynum Studio, link in the description. Thank you so much to NordVPN for sponsoring this video, and let's get back to it. Okay, so now that we have one enemy, what are we going to do for the second? Well, for that we're going to once again use the enemy actions I wrote down. And I think for this one we're going to go with the shoot bullet action, which luckily means it's fairly similar to the dash enemy, meaning I was able to copy a lot of the code. Only thing I really had to do was replace all references to dashing with shooting, and within about 30 minutes we now have an enemy that can, well, not exactly shoot, but it can write bullet shot in the console, which is something. But obviously an enemy like this would be a bit too easy. So I made a very simple bullet and wrote a couple lines of code to shoot it towards the player. And there you go, that is much better. But even though I did a lot more to improve the enemy after that, this video is already getting way too long, so if you don't mind, we're just gonna skip all of that and just move on to the next enemy, which was supposed to be an enemy based on the boomerang action. But when I actually started working on it, I began to realise something. Something not just about this enemy, but also the 2 other enemies we made. Something I really didn't want to be true, but the moment I saw it, I could no longer deny. These enemies sucked. And they weren't just bad, even worse than that, they were boring. And for some reason, I didn't see it. In me trying to ignore the fact that they didn't look good, I accidentally ignored that they didn't feel good. But looking back, I was doomed to fail from the start. I was naive. I thought if I ignored art, I would magically start designing better. And honestly, I thought I was. Because the flaws that I did see, I thought were simply flaws in appearance, not in actual gameplay. But I now realise that, for me, there's actually very little difference. How a game feels is inherently tied to the way it looks, which is why me just completely ignoring that caused me to make such bad enemies. But now that I know this, does that change anything? Is this finally the revelation that allows me to design good enemies, like I thought the squares thing would be? I doubt it. But in the end, there's only really one way to find out. Now, you might think that this means I'm going right back to making art, but that's not the case. I have learned from my mistakes and don't intend on repeating them. So instead of drawing a brand new enemy or making it a square, we're going to be using this, a sprite from an old enemy that I drew more than 2 years ago. But that's it. We're not going to make a walking animation for it, we're not even going to flip it when it moves in the other direction, because it's not really about it looking good, it's more about it not being abstract. However, a drawing moving towards the player isn't exactly a good enemy, so let's look one more time at the enemy actions, and specifically the final row. Here there's an idea called the underground attack that I think will be perfect. The way this attack works is that the enemy makes things come up from the ground to attack the player, basically exactly like the evoker in Minecraft. And this was actually fairly easy to implement. Within about 30 minutes we had red dots moving towards the player, and within about an hour we had a pretty functional prototype of an enemy. And technically, if we're just focusing on gameplay, this means we're pretty much done. But we're not, because now it was actually time to add some more art. First we're going to take two more sprites from old animations I made, a telegraph sprite and an attack sprite. These will let us know when the enemy is going to attack and when it's stopped attacking. We're also going to replace the red dots with this cabinet sprite that I drew about a year ago. For this one though, we are going to make a very short animation of it coming out of the ground, and putting all of those things together we get this. Now, I have no idea what you think of this, but my brain tells me that it's miles better than the other enemies, or at the very least, it feels much better. But there is one thing that still feels bad about this enemy, and that's the fact that it's way too easy. You don't even have to really try to avoid the cabinets. As long as you're moving, you're totally fine. So to fix this, instead of spawning them directly towards your position, I changed it to spawn where it thinks you will be, based on how you're moving. Which means that if you're moving right, it'll spawn the cabinets slightly to your right, making you way more likely to run into them. And this single change made this enemy go from pretty okay to genuinely good. Which, honestly, after all of this, was kind of the last thing I expected. And I know this video may have seemed like a huge waste of time, because that's kind of how I feel about working on this for the last 2 months. But I do think it was important to have gone through this, to realise that there is no magical solution, that making your enemy square isn't suddenly going to make you a game design god. That can only come from time and experience. And even though making one good enemy is a great start, it's also nowhere near the end.